Good evening, and welcome back. There is a library beneath the hills of Rome where the oldest questions in the world are kept in silence. Its corridors stretch further than most visitors are permitted to walk, and its shelves hold documents that crossed deserts on the backs of camels, survived fires that consumed entire cities, and passed through the hands of empires that no longer exist. Somewhere within those vaulted rooms, among the Syriac manuscripts and the Coptic fragments and the texts that arrived from Byzantium when that city fell, there are pages that describe beings who came down from the sky before the first kings of Mesopotamia learned to write their names in clay. The institution that guards those pages has watched the sky for longer than any other organization in the Western world, and it has never fully explained why. 45 centuries before the birth of Rome, the people of the river valleys between the Tigris and the Euphrates were already old. They built cities of mud, brick, and lamplight. They kept records of the stars with a precision that still puzzles modern astronomers, and they left behind thousands of clay tablets describing a pantheon of beings they called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. These were not vague spiritual metaphors. They had names, ranks, and responsibilities. They built, they judged, they measured, and the oldest surviving texts suggest that they departed, and that their departure was understood, even then, as something temporary. The Book of Enoch was removed from the Western Christian canon in the 4th century and was not seen again in Europe for 1400 years. When it returned, carried back from the highlands of Ethiopia in 1773, it described the same beings under different names, the same descent, the same intermingling with humanity, and the same promise woven into the oldest astronomical cycles that humanity has ever recorded. Scholars who have read both traditions carefully have noted the convergences. Theologians who encountered those same convergences grew quiet in ways that their surviving writings do not entirely explain. What was known, it seems, was known by more than one kind of institution, and it was not always shared freely. Tonight, as the hour grows still and the world outside settles into darkness, we will move slowly through that long conversation between the sky and the earth, from the reed marshes of ancient Sumer to the candlelit reading rooms of Rome, from the first priests who recorded the descent to the astronomers in cassocks, who have pointed their instruments at the same stars for centuries and returned to their desks without saying everything they saw. This is not a story that ends. It is a story that was paused, and those who paused it were careful, and those who were careful left traces, and those traces are still here. Now let us ease into tonight's journey together. Good evening, and welcome back. If you're settling in for the night, perhaps drawing a blanket a little closer, or dimming the light beside you, then you have arrived at exactly the right moment. Tonight, we are going to move slowly, the way a river moves through flat country in the last hour before dark, without urgency, without noise, carrying everything it carries with a kind of patient, unhurried authority. What if the oldest questions your civilization ever asked were never truly answered, only archived? What if the beings described on the earliest surviving written records in human history were not symbols or metaphors, but the first attempt by careful observers to document something they had genuinely witnessed? And what if the institution that guards more ancient manuscripts than any other organization in the Western world has spent centuries reading those same accounts in rooms where very few people are permitted to sit? Take a breath. There is no need to hold it. Before we begin, if you're finding this kind of slow, unhurried documentary useful for your evenings, a quiet like or a subscription means a great deal to this channel, and it helps others who are searching for something calm to find their way here. If you feel moved to leave a comment, we would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what the hour looks like outside your window. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that people in different latitudes under different skies are wrestling with the same ancient questions at the same time. Now find whatever position is most comfortable for you. If there is a fan or some gentle background sound nearby, let it settle into the edges of your hearing. If the light in your room can go a little lower, let it. There is nothing you need to follow closely tonight, nothing you need to remember or record. The story will carry you the same way stories have always carried people through the dark hours, from the first fires lit in the reed marshes of Mesopotamia to the particular quiet of wherever you are right now. The word Anunnaki appears in Sumerian cuneiform texts that are among the oldest written documents in human history. Scholars place the earliest of these tablets at roughly 4,000 years before the Common Era, though the traditions they record are understood to be considerably older, passed down through oral recitation long before anyone pressed a stylus into wet clay and left it to dry in the sun. The name itself in the Sumerian language carried meanings that scholars have translated in various ways over the decades, though the most widely cited interpretation reads as something close to those of royal blood, or in a more literal rendering, those who from heaven to earth came. The translation has been debated. The tablets themselves have not. In the city of Nippur, which sat near the centre of the Mesopotamian plain between the two great rivers, excavations beginning in the late 19th century uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets buried beneath centuries of accumulated mud and rubble. Among them were portions of creation narratives, king lists stretching back into what the scribes themselves called the time before the flood, hymns addressed to specific named beings, and administrative records describing offerings, land grants, and ritual calendars organised around the movements of celestial bodies. The tablets were written by scribes who trained for years to master the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform, young men who sat in the aduba, the tablet house, copying and recopying ancient texts by the light of oil lamps, their breath visible in the cool morning air of early spring, their fingers pressing meaning into clay that would outlast every empire that ever claimed to own the land beneath their feet. Those scribes were not writing mythology in the way a modern reader might understand the word. They were recording what their culture understood to be history, cosmology, and theology woven into a single continuous fabric. The beings they described were given specific roles in the ordering of the world. Some were assigned to the heavens, some to the earth, some to the deep waters beneath the ground. They held councils, they issued judgments, they argued among themselves with a specificity and a personality that reads, even across the distance of 40 centuries, less like allegory and more like memory. Scholars approach these texts with appropriate caution and rigour, and the mainstream academic view is careful to distinguish ancient religious narrative from literal historical record, and yet the texts persist, and the questions they contain persist alongside them. What makes this particular tradition remarkable, beyond its age, is its continuity. The Anunnaki do not appear in a single text and disappear. They travel through thousands of tablets across more than 2,000 years of Mesopotamian writing, from the earliest Sumerian city-states through the Akkadian Empire, through the Babylonian period, through the Assyrian libraries assembled by kings who understood that collecting ancient tablets was a form of power. When the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal built his great library at Nineveh in the 7th century before the Common Era, his scribes were sent across the known world specifically to copy and acquire ancient texts, and the narratives describing the Anunnaki were among those gathered and preserved with deliberate institutional care. Someone, across a very long stretch of time, thought these accounts were worth keeping. The same pattern would repeat itself. Different cultures, different centuries, different languages, and yet the same impulse to preserve the oldest accounts of beings who moved between the sky and the earth, who shaped the early world and then withdrew from it. The Book of Enoch, the Zoroastrian Avesta, fragments of Phoenician cosmological writing preserved in later Greek sources, the traditions carried west by Jewish scholars during the Babylonian exile, and eventually the vast acquisitions of the institution in Rome that would come to hold more ancient manuscripts than almost any other collection in the world. The thread is long. It does not break cleanly anywhere along its length. Tonight we will follow that thread with patience, moving the way a careful reader moves through an old text in a quiet room, not rushing toward conclusions, but allowing each passage to settle before turning to the next. The hour is yours. The story has been waiting a very long time, and it is in no particular hurry. Now let us ease into tonight's journey together. Before there were kings, there were cities. And before the cities were fully cities, there were the riverbanks, the seasonal floods that left behind a dark, rich sediment along the edges of the Euphrates and the Tigris, and the slow accumulation of human settlement around the places where the water was most generous and most predictable. The land between the two rivers, the region later generations would call Mesopotamia, was not a hospitable place in the way that mountains or coastlines can feel hospitable, offering shelter or natural beauty to comfort the eye. It was flat, treeless in many stretches, subject to flooding and drought in alternating seasons, and yet it was here, scholars believe, that something unprecedented happened in the history of the human animal. People stopped moving and began to build. The earlier settlements that archaeologists have uncovered in this region date to roughly the 6th and 5th millennia before the Common Era, clusters of mud brick structures arranged around central buildings that appear to have served both administrative and ceremonial functions. The houses were modest, their walls thick enough to hold some coolness against the summer heat, their floors packed earth covered with woven reed mats. Inside, a household might keep clay vessels of barley and emmer wheat, jars of date wine sealed with bitumen, oil lamps burning rendered animal fat that cast a warm and unsteady light across the faces of the people gathered there in the evening. Outside, the irrigation channels that allowed agriculture in this otherwise difficult landscape required constant maintenance, the kind of coordinated communal labour that demands sooner or later someone to organise it. And so the first administrative structures emerged not from ambition alone, but from the practical requirements of water and grain. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, some of these settlements had grown into something that deserves the name city. Uruk, which sits in the southern part of what is now Iraq, is among the most extensively studied of these early urban centres, and the archaeological layers beneath its surface tell a story of expansion that unfolded over centuries with a kind of organic momentum. At its height, Uruk may have held a population of somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people, a number that would have made it one of the largest concentrations of human beings anywhere on Earth at that time. Its temples were built on raised platforms of mud brick, their facades decorated with thousands of small clay cones pressed into the walls in geometric patterns, and its scribes were producing the earliest known examples of written language, pressed into clay tablets in the simplified pictographic script that would gradually evolve into cuneiform. It is within this world, and within the texts that emerged from it across the following centuries, that the Anunnaki first appear in written form. The surviving accounts describe them not as distant or abstract powers, but as presences woven into the fabric of daily life, beings who had established the cities, who had given humanity the gifts of agriculture and law and the calendar that organised the agricultural year, and who resided, at least in some sense, within the great temple complexes that dominated the skyline of every major Sumerian settlement. The ziggurat, the stepped pyramid of mud brick that rose above the flat surrounding plain, was understood not merely as a place of worship but as a dwelling, a house built at a scale appropriate for beings of a different order than the humans who maintained it and brought it offerings of bread and beer and incense smoke rising in the morning air. The priests who served these temples were among the most educated members of Sumerian society, trained in mathematics, astronomy, and the careful management of the institutional records that tracked land ownership, labour allocation, and the seasonal movements of the stars. A young man entering the priesthood in the city of Ur or Lagash might spend years learning the cuneiform script before he was permitted to copy the most important ritual texts, sitting cross-legged on a reed mat in the scribal school, while a senior priest dictated from memory the hymns and narrative cycles that described the nature and history of the Anunnaki. These were not casual stories told for entertainment, though they may have served that purpose as well. They were understood as precise accounts of how the world had come to be arranged as it was, why the stars moved in the patterns they moved in, and what obligations humanity carried as a result of the relationship between the human world and the divine one. Among the most significant of these narratives is the one scholars call the Atrahasis, an account of creation and catastrophe that predates the more widely known biblical flood narrative by well over 1,000 years. In it, the Anunnaki are described as divided between two groups, those of the heavens and those assigned to the labour of maintaining the earth, and the tension between these groups sets the story in motion. The labour of the earth, in this account, was eventually transferred to a newly created race of beings, fashioned from clay and the blood of a divine figure, and set to work maintaining the irrigation systems and agricultural land that the Anunnaki had previously managed themselves. Scholars approach this narrative as a sophisticated cosmological text, one that encodes early Mesopotamian understandings of the relationship between divine authority and human obligation, between the order of the heavens and the labour of the earth below. What is worth sitting with, as the hour grows quieter around you, is the texture of the world these texts describe. The Anunnaki in the Sumerian sources are not remote or untouchable in the way that divine beings are sometimes imagined. They eat, they drink. They hold assemblies and arrive at decisions through discussion and disagreement. They experience something that the texts render as grief or anger or satisfaction, depending on the circumstances. A hymn to the goddess Inanna, one of the most important figures in the Sumerian pantheon, describes her preparation for a ceremonial journey with a level of sensory detail that reads almost like a traveller's account. The oils applied to her skin, the garments arranged over her body, the ornaments placed at her throat and wrists. The specificity is deliberate. It is the specificity of beings whose reality the scribes who recorded them did not appear to doubt. The cities built in their names rose and fell across centuries as cities do. Uruk declined as Ur grew, and Ur declined as Babylon rose. And through all of it, the tablets kept moving, copied and recopied, carried by priests and merchants and scholars who understood that the oldest accounts contained something worth preserving beyond the life of any single city or dynasty. When the Great Library of Ashurbanipal was assembled at Nineveh in the 7th century before the Common Era, the Anunnaki narratives were among the texts gathered from across the known world and stored in clay jars, stacked in rooms that were designed to last. The library did not last in the end, but the tablets did, scattered and buried and eventually uncovered again by archaeologists who carried them to museums where they remain today, readable, patient, and very old. There is a particular quality to the silence inside an archive. It is not the silence of an empty room, which is simply the absence of sound, but something more layered and deliberate, the silence of things that have already said everything they intended to say and are now simply waiting to be read again. The ancient city of Nippur, which sat roughly halfway between the modern Iraqi cities of Baghdad and Basra, on what was once the broad reed-fringed plain of central Mesopotamia, was not the largest or most politically powerful of the Sumerian city-states. It was not a seat of empire in the way that Ur or Uruk or later Babylon would be, and yet Nippur survived as a centre of religious and intellectual life for longer than almost any other city in the ancient world, remaining significant through Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Kassite, and Assyrian periods, a continuous thread of scribal tradition stretching across more than 3,000 years. The reason for that continuity was the city's relationship with Enlil, one of the most senior figures in the Sumerian pantheon and among the most frequently named of the Anunnaki in the surviving texts. Nippur was understood to be Enlil's city, the place where his great temple, the Ekur, whose name translated roughly as mountain house, rose above the flat surrounding landscape on a raised platform of carefully maintained mud brick. The Ekur was not merely a religious site. It functioned as the symbolic centre of Sumerian civilization, the place where kingship was understood to be legitimized, where a ruler who wished to be recognized as having genuine authority over the cities of the plain needed to secure the blessing of Enlil's priesthood. Kings sent offerings to Nippur from as far as the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, and the city's scribal schools trained priests and administrators who carried the written traditions of Sumerian learning outward across the region like seeds carried on seasonal wind. It was beneath the accumulated rubble of this city that, beginning in 1889, a series of excavations sponsored by the University of Pennsylvania uncovered what would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the study of ancient literature. Over several seasons of careful and at times difficult fieldwork in the heat and dust of the central Iraqi plain, excavators recovered more than 30,000 clay tablet fragments from the ruins of Nippur, many of them from a building that appears to have served as a scribal school and archive. The tablets ranged in date from roughly 2,500 to 1,700 before the Common Era, covering nearly 8 centuries of continuous scribal activity, and their contents included hymns, lamentations, mathematical exercises, medical texts, legal records, and, most significantly for the purposes of this story, major portions of the great Sumerian literary and mythological cycles that describe the nature, history, and activities of the Anunnaki. Among the texts recovered from Nippur were portions of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation narrative whose name derives from its opening words, meaning "when on high," and which describes the formation of the world from the division of a primordial body, the establishment of the heavens and the earth, and the creation of humanity to serve the gods. The text gives specific roles to specific named Anunnaki figures, arranges them in a clear hierarchy of authority, and describes their assembly as a governing body that makes decisions collectively, argues, reaches consensus, and delegates responsibility across different domains of the natural world. Marduk, who rises to preeminence in the Babylonian version of the narrative, was not always the central figure in the older Sumerian tellings, where Enlil occupied a more prominent position, and the differences between versions across centuries reveal a living tradition, one that was edited and reinterpreted as political power shifted between cities and dynasties, while the fundamental structure of beings governing the cosmos from positions of organized authority remained consistent throughout. The Atrahasis text, portions of which were also found among the Nippur tablets, adds a layer of detail that has occupied scholars for generations. In this account, the creation of humanity is motivated by a specific practical need. The lesser divine beings, the Igigi, had grown weary of the labour required to maintain the irrigation systems and agricultural infrastructure of the earth, and their rebellion against this labour created a crisis that the senior Anunnaki needed to resolve. The solution, according to the text, was the fashioning of a new kind of being from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain divine figure, a being capable of bearing the burden of agricultural labour and relieving the Igigi of their toil. Scholars analyse this narrative as a sophisticated reflection on the nature of work, hierarchy, and the relationship between human societies and the divine order that was understood to govern them. The text's account of a subsequent flood, sent in response to the noise and multiplication of the newly created humans, contains structural parallels to the later biblical flood narrative that have been noted and debated extensively in academic literature since the 19th century. A scribe copying the Atrahasis in the tablet house at Nippur sometime around 1800 before the Common Era would have approached his work with a reverence shaped by years of training. He would have sat in the early morning before the day's heat became oppressive with a fresh tablet of dampened clay resting on a board across his knees, a stylus of reed cut to the correct angle held in his right hand, and the text being dictated by a senior priest from a master tablet kept in the archive. The act of copying was itself understood as a form of service, a way of ensuring that the accounts of the Anunnaki and their relationship to humanity would survive beyond the life of any single tablet, any single city, any single dynasty. The scribe pressed his stylus into the clay with a practiced economy of long habit, leaving behind the wedge-shaped impressions that encoded words in a language he had spent years learning to read and write, and when the tablet was complete it would be dried in the sun or fired in a kiln and placed in the archive alongside the other tablets, stacked in clay jars or arranged on wooden shelves in the cool interior of the Akure's storage rooms. What those rooms contained, at their fullest, was something close to a complete record of how one of the world's earliest civilizations understood its own origins. The Anunnaki in the Nippur texts are not vague or allegorical. They are named, ranked, and assigned specific functions. Enlil governs the atmosphere and the movement of air. Enki governs the deep waters and is associated with wisdom, craft, and the arts of civilization. Ninhursag is associated with birth and the fertile earth. Inanna governs love, conflict, and the planet that Mesopotamian astronomers tracked with particular care across the night sky. Each of these figures appears across hundreds of tablets, in hymns, in narrative cycles, in lament texts composed after the destruction of cities, in ritual instructions describing the correct forms of offering and prayer. The consistency and the volume of this material suggest not a casual folk tradition, but an institutional body of knowledge maintained across generations with the same care that later civilizations would apply to their own most sacred texts. The tablets waited in the dark beneath Nippur for 4,000 years. They are still being read. Ideas do not respect borders. They travel with merchants who pack them alongside bolts of dyed wool and jars of cedar resin, with soldiers who carry them home in memory after years of service in foreign garrisons, with priests who flee conquered cities bearing whatever sacred text they can carry, wrapped in linen against their bodies. The ancient Near East, for all its rivalries and destructions, was a remarkably porous world in terms of the movement of knowledge, and the great cosmological traditions of Mesopotamia did not remain confined to the cities of the Tigris and Euphrates plain. They moved westward and northward across centuries, translated and retold and woven into new narrative frameworks by people who recognized in the old Sumerian accounts something that corresponded to their own inherited traditions, something about the sky, about beings who descended from it, and about the complicated, unresolved relationship between those beings and the human world below. Among the most significant vehicles for this westward transmission was the experience of the Jewish exile in Babylon, which began in 586 before the Common Era, when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem and carried a substantial portion of the Judean population into captivity in Mesopotamia. The exiles who arrived in Babylon found themselves in the most sophisticated urban environment of the ancient world at that time. a city of processional avenues and glazed tile facades, of temples dedicated to Marduk, and a priesthood that maintained astronomical records going back centuries. The encounter between the exiled Judean tradition and the living Babylonian cosmological inheritance was, scholars broadly agree, one of the most consequential cultural collisions in the history of religion, and its effects can be traced in the layers of the Hebrew Bible, where older Israelite traditions were edited, expanded, and set into new relationships with narratives that carry clear Mesopotamian structural echoes. But the most direct bridge between the Anunnaki tradition and the later Western religious inheritance passed through a text that spent 14 centuries largely invisible to European readers. The Book of Enoch, whose oldest surviving portion scholars date to roughly the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, is a complex and layered work that draws on traditions considerably older than its written form. Its central narrative concerns a figure named Enoch, described in the Hebrew biblical tradition as a man who walked with God and was taken rather than dying in the ordinary way, and it expands this brief enigmatic reference into an elaborate account of Enoch's journeys through the heavens and his encounters with the beings who governed the celestial realms. The section that has attracted the most sustained scholarly and popular attention is the one dealing with the Watchers, a group of divine beings who descended to the earth, intermingled with humanity, transmitted forbidden knowledge, and whose presence on earth set in motion the chain of events that culminated in the Great Flood. The Watchers in the Book of Enoch are named individually, assigned specific areas of forbidden knowledge that they transmitted to humanity, and described as entering into relationships with human women that produced a race of giant offspring. The leader of the descent is named Semyasa, and under him 200 Watchers are said to have gathered on a mountain identified as Hermon, in the region that corresponds roughly to the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, and to have bound themselves with an oath before descending. The knowledge they transmitted, according to the text, included metalworking, the preparation of cosmetics and dyes, enchantments, and most significantly, the reading of celestial signs, the very astronomical knowledge that had been the exclusive province of the Mesopotamian priestly class for centuries. The parallel with the Anunnaki tradition, in which divine beings bring the arts of civilization to humanity, is structural and difficult to dismiss, and scholars who study both traditions note the convergence with careful interest. The Book of Enoch was not a marginal text in the early period of Jewish and Christian religious development. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1947, confirming that it was read and preserved by at least some Jewish communities in the centuries immediately before and after the Common Era begins. The New Testament letter attributed to Jude contains a direct quotation from the Book of Enoch, identifying it as a text familiar to at least some early Christian communities and authoritative enough to cite in an apostolic letter. Several of the early Christian writers who are grouped under the heading of the Church Fathers engaged with the Enochic tradition seriously and at length, attempting to reconcile its account of the Watchers with the developing Orthodox understanding of the nature of angels and divine beings. The tradition was not hidden in this early period. It was argued over, which is a different thing entirely. The process by which the Book of Enoch moved from active engagement to effective disappearance in Western Christianity was gradual rather than sudden. The Council of Laodicea, held around 363 of the Common Era, produced a canon of acceptable scriptural texts that did not include it. Later councils reinforced this exclusion, and as the institutional church consolidated its authority over which texts were considered sacred and which were considered apocryphal or worse, the Book of Enoch receded from the mainstream of Western religious life. It did not disappear entirely. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church continued to include it in its biblical canon, which is why the most complete surviving manuscript of the text was preserved in Ethiopia, while European libraries held at best fragments and references. The book was not destroyed. It was, in a sense, transferred, moved to the care of a tradition that made different decisions about what to keep close and what to set aside. What travelled with the Watcher tradition, as it moved through these different cultural containers, was something more than narrative detail. It carried a specific claim about the structure of the cosmos and humanity's place within it, namely that the human world had been shaped, for good and for ill, by the intervention of non-human beings who came from a domain other than the Earth, that this intervention had left traces in human knowledge and human bloodlines, and that the events it set in motion had not reached a final resolution, The Sumerian scribes who recorded the Anunnaki cycles, the Babylonian priests who maintained the astronomical traditions, the authors of the Enochic literature, and the early Christian communities who read those texts and argued over them were not, in this sense, describing entirely different things. They were describing the same fundamental problem in the vocabularies available to them, each one passing the question forward to the next generation of careful readers, each one leaving it, in the end, unanswered. The question arrived, eventually, in Rome. Rome did not set out to become the custodian of the ancient world's knowledge. It became that custodian the way it became most things, gradually, through conquest and absorption, and the particular Roman genius for recognizing what was worth keeping from the civilizations it overwhelmed. When Roman armies moved through the eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, they encountered a world of extraordinary intellectual depth, cities where libraries had been accumulating manuscripts for generations, where scholars worked in multiple languages, and where the cosmological traditions of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, and Greece had been in conversation with one another for long enough that the boundaries between them had grown genuinely difficult to trace. Rome absorbed this world not all at once, but incrementally, and what it absorbed it carried westward, transformed in the carrying. The city of Alexandria in Egypt represented the most concentrated expression of this accumulated ancient knowledge, and Rome's relationship with Alexandria was long, complicated, and consequential for the history of what survived. The Great Library of Alexandria, established under the Ptolemaic dynasty in the 3rd century before the Common Era, had been designed from its founding as a universal collection, an institution whose explicit ambition was to hold a copy of every significant text in the known world. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were required by law to surrender any manuscripts they carried for copying, and the library's agents were dispatched across the Mediterranean and into the Near East to acquire texts by purchase, negotiation, or more aggressive means. Among the materials gathered in this way were texts that had travelled from Mesopotamia, Babylonian astronomical records, cosmological narratives in Aramaic and Syriac translation, and works influenced by the priestly intellectual traditions of the great Mesopotamian temple complexes that the Macedonian conquests of Alexander III had opened to Greek scholarly attention. The famous destruction of the Library of Alexandria is, historians note, considerably more complicated than the single dramatic event that popular imagination has tended to reduce it to. The library suffered damage and loss across multiple centuries and through multiple incidents, and the picture of one catastrophic fire consuming all of ancient knowledge in a single night is not supported by the historical record. What the evidence does show is a long, uneven decline, punctuated by specific incidents of damage that unfolded across roughly 7 centuries and left survivors, both institutional and textual, that were absorbed into other collections as Roman power consolidated its hold over the eastern Mediterranean. Some of what the Library of Alexandria held did not perish. It was copied, translated, moved, and eventually deposited in the growing archive that Rome was quietly assembling within its own walls. The Roman period of expansion brought the empire into direct contact with communities that were the living inheritors of the Mesopotamian intellectual tradition. Jewish communities throughout the eastern Mediterranean and in Rome itself maintained access to texts and traditions shaped by the Babylonian exile, and many of these communities engaged actively with the cosmological questions that the Enochic and related literature raised. Greek-speaking scholars in cities like Antioch and Alexandria had for generations been working to synthesize Platonic philosophy, Jewish scripture, and older Near Eastern cosmology into unified intellectual frameworks, and some of these scholars eventually made their way to Rome, carrying their manuscripts and their questions with them. The result was a city that, by the 1st century of the Common Era, contained an extraordinary diversity of cosmological traditions, all in active conversation, competition, and occasional conflict with one another. It was into this world that the early Christian movement expanded, and the institutional choices made by the developing church during its first 4 centuries regarding which texts to accept, which to exclude, and which to preserve in restricted form had consequences that extended far beyond the religious communities of late antiquity. The church that emerged from the Council of Nicaea in 325 of the Common Era and gradually consolidated its authority over the western half of the crumbling Roman Empire inherited not only a theological tradition, but a physical one, buildings, land, libraries, and the administrative infrastructure of an institution that had been accumulating resources for 3 centuries. When the Western Roman Empire effectively dissolved across the 5th century, the Church was among the very few institutions with the organisational capacity to maintain archives and scriptoria, the rooms where monks copied manuscripts by hand, ensuring that texts survived the collapse of the political structures that had previously supported intellectual life. What the Church chose to copy and preserve during this period was shaped by theological priorities, and the choices made were not always uniform or consistent. Different monasteries in different regions preserved different materials, and the network of scriptoria that spread across Europe in the early medieval period contained, collectively, a remarkably heterogeneous body of texts. Alongside the approved biblical canon and the writings of the Orthodox Church Fathers, manuscripts survived that engaged with traditions the official Church had ruled out of bounds, commentaries on apocryphal texts, works that drew on Neoplatonic cosmology, fragments that preserved elements of the older Near Eastern traditions in forms that had been partially absorbed into Christian theological language. The monks who copied these texts were not always copying them because they endorsed their contents. They were copying them because copying was what monks did, and because the accumulated wisdom of the past, even its more troubling corners, was understood as something that ought not to be simply abandoned to decay. The papacy's own archive grew across these centuries through a combination of deliberate acquisition and the natural accumulation that attaches itself to any institution that occupies a fixed location long enough. Gifts of manuscripts from rulers who wished to demonstrate their piety and their learning, materials confiscated during the suppression of movements the Church deemed heretical, texts acquired when monasteries were dissolved or absorbed into Roman oversight, and the ongoing output of the Vatican's own scriptoria, all fed into a collection that by the medieval period had become something genuinely without parallel in the Western world. The physical space of the archive expanded across centuries, and the system of cataloguing and access that governed it became increasingly elaborate and increasingly controlled. Not everything that arrived was made freely available. Some portions of the collection were understood from an early period to require more careful management than others, and the reasons for that care were not always made explicit in the institutional records that survived. Rome inherited the ancient libraries the way a river inherits the streams that feed into it, carrying everything forward without always making visible what came from which source. The question of what specifically arrived, what was read, what was understood, and what was quietly set apart in the deepest rooms of the archive is one that the institution has never answered fully. The archive is old, and it is large, and it is patient in exactly the way that very old things tend to be patient, willing to wait for the questions to catch up with what it holds. There is a particular hour in Rome, in the deep middle of the afternoon in late autumn, when the light comes through the high windows of old buildings at an angle so low and so golden that it seems to arrive from somewhere further away than the sun. It moves across stone floors in long pale rectangles, illuminating the particles of dust that drift through the still air of rooms that have not changed their essential character in centuries, and it falls on the spines of bound volumes and the edges of folded manuscripts with an indifference that is also a kind of equality, touching everything with the same unhurried light. The Apostolic Library of the Holy See, which most people know simply as the Vatican Library, occupies a series of interconnected halls and galleries within the northern wing of the Vatican Palace, and in that particular afternoon light its reading rooms have an atmosphere that is not easy to describe in purely functional terms. It feels, to those who have worked within it, less like a library in the modern sense, and more like a place where time has been deliberately slowed. The formal founding of the Vatican Library is documented as occurring under Pope Nicholas V in the middle of the 15th century, though the institution itself is considerably older than that date suggests. Nicholas V, who reigned from 1447 to 1455, was a scholar before he was a pope, a man who had spent his earlier life acquiring books with a devotion that his contemporaries noted as something close to compulsion, and when he ascended to the papacy, he brought that devotion with him and directed it toward the creation of an institution worthy of the Church's position as the inheritor of Rome's universal authority. He hired scholars to translate Greek manuscripts into Latin, dispatched agents across Italy and into the Eastern Mediterranean to purchase or copy texts that were not already represented in the papal collection, and began the construction of dedicated rooms within the Vatican Palace designed specifically to house and preserve manuscripts. At his death, the collection numbered somewhere around 900 volumes, the foundation on which his successors would build for the next 5 centuries. The library's most significant period of expansion came in the decades following 1453, when the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman forces of Mehmed II sent a wave of Byzantine scholars westward into Italy, many of them carrying manuscripts that had survived the final centuries of the Eastern Roman Empire in the libraries of Constantinople's monasteries and imperial collections. These scholars arrived in Rome, in Florence, in Venice, and in other Italian cities, bringing with them Greek philosophical texts, theological works, scientific manuscripts, and materials that preserved traditions of learning stretching back, in some cases, to the great libraries of the Hellenistic world. Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned from 1471 to 1484, opened the library to qualified scholars and appointed the first official Vatican librarian, establishing the institutional framework that has governed the collection ever since. The rooms he designated for the library's use were decorated with frescoes that still survive, and their walls have looked down on readers working with ancient texts for more than 500 years. The physical experience of working in the Vatican Library today is shaped by procedures that reflect both the extreme age and the extreme value of what the collection contains. Readers who are granted access, and access requires credentials and application and approval, enter through the Porta di Sant'Anna and pass through security into a world that operates at a different pace from the city outside. The reading rooms are cool and quiet, the light controlled to protect the materials on the tables, and the manuscripts themselves arrive from the stacks in archival boxes, carried by staff who handle them with the practiced care of people who understand that some of what they are carrying is irreplaceable in a way that goes beyond monetary value. A reader might spend an entire morning with a single manuscript, turning its pages with the aid of a foam wedge, making notes by hand because some areas of the reading rooms restrict the use of certain equipment, sitting in the particular silence of a room where serious attention to old things is the only activity taking place. The collection the library holds today numbers roughly 80,000 manuscripts and over 1,600,000 printed books, along with maps, prints, coins, and archival documents that extend the institution's holdings into territory that overlaps with the separate Vatican Apostolic Archive, which was administratively distinct from the library until relatively recently. Among the library's most significant manuscript holdings are the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest and most complete surviving manuscripts of the Christian Bible, dating to the 4th century of the Common Era, and a vast collection of Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Arabic, Hebrew, and other language manuscripts that represents the accumulated acquisitions of 5 centuries of institutional collecting. The Syriac and Coptic materials are of particular interest in the context of the traditions we have been following through this account, because it is through Syriac and Coptic transmission that many of the older Near Eastern cosmological texts, including materials related to the Enochic tradition and to Mesopotamian-influenced theological writing, travelled into the Christian world and eventually into the care of institutions like this one. The library's archive of unedited and unstudied manuscripts remains, by all scholarly accounts, enormous. The institution employs a permanent staff of scholars and conservators, and external researchers from universities and research institutions around the world are granted access to the collection each year, but the sheer volume of material means that significant portions of the holdings have received only preliminary cataloguing and have never been subjected to the kind of close scholarly attention that might reveal their full significance. This is not, scholars are careful to note, evidence of deliberate concealment. It is the straightforward consequence of institutional scale, of a collection that grew faster across 5 centuries than any finite number of scholars could fully process. And yet the gap between what the library is known to hold and what has been fully studied is wide enough that serious researchers speak of it with something that sounds, underneath the professional restraint, like a form of quiet wonder. There are rooms in the Vatican Library that most visitors will never enter, not because they are sealed against all access, but because the layered protocols of scholarly credentialing and institutional permission form a threshold that relatively few people have the combination of need, qualification, and patience to cross. The oldest materials in the collection rest in climate-controlled storage in conditions designed to slow the decay that afflicts all organic things given sufficient time. The vellum of medieval manuscripts, the papyrus of even older fragments, the leather bindings stamped with the devices of long-dead collectors, all of it is preserved in the cool and the dark, waiting with the particular patience of things that have already survived far longer than anyone originally expected them to. The light that falls through the high windows of the reading rooms does not reach those storage areas. There, the ancient materials rest in a darkness that is also a form of keeping, and what they contain has been accumulating page by careful page for longer than the institution itself has known exactly what it holds. A manuscript that survives for 1,000 years does not do so by accident. It survives because someone, at each critical moment when it might otherwise have been lost, made a decision to carry it forward, to copy it when the original began to decay, to wrap it in oiled cloth against the damp of a sea crossing, to bury it in a sealed jar when armies approached the city walls, or simply to place it on a shelf in a room with a sound roof and return to it regularly enough to notice when the binding needed repair. The survival of ancient texts is not a passive process. It is the accumulated result of thousands of individual acts of preservation, each one motivated by a belief, conscious or otherwise, that what the text contained was worth the effort of keeping it alive. When we ask how certain ancient cosmological traditions arrived in the Vatican Library, we're really asking who made those decisions across the centuries between the text's origin and its current resting place, and what they understood themselves to be preserving. The single most consequential event for the transmission of ancient manuscripts into Western European collections was the fall of Constantinople on the 29th of May, 1453, when the forces of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of a city that had served as the eastern capital of the Roman Empire and subsequently as the centre of Byzantine Christian civilization for more than 1,000 years. The scholars and clergy who fled Constantinople in the years immediately before and after the city's fall carried with them whatever they could transport, and what they chose to transport reveals something about what their community valued most. Greek philosophical texts, theological commentaries, astronomical and mathematical works, and materials that had been preserved in the libraries of Constantinople's monasteries and imperial palace since the city's founding in the 4th century, were loaded onto ships in the harbour and carried westward to Italian ports, where, in many cases, humanist scholars and papal agents were already waiting to receive them. Pope Nicholas V, whose role in formally organising the Vatican Library has already been noted, was particularly active in acquiring manuscripts from these displaced Byzantine scholars, and the papal treasury was directed toward purchases that enriched the collection with Greek-language materials that had been almost entirely absent from Western European libraries during the preceding medieval centuries. Among those who arrived in Rome carrying manuscripts was Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek scholar and churchman who had been born in Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, and who brought with him to Italy a personal collection of Greek manuscripts that numbered in the hundreds, and that he eventually donated to the city of Venice, where it formed the nucleus of the Bibliotheca Marciana. Bessarion's collection contained texts that had travelled from Mesopotamia and Persia through Byzantine scholarly transmission across many centuries, and his own writings show a man deeply engaged with the question of how the ancient cosmological traditions of the pre-Christian world related to Christian theology. The Syriac manuscript tradition represents a separate and equally important channel through which ancient Near Eastern materials entered the Vatican's holdings. Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic closely related to the language spoken in much of the ancient Near East, served as the primary literary and liturgical language of several Eastern Christian communities, including the Church of the East, the Syrian Orthodox Church, and the Maronite Church of Lebanon, and the monasteries of these communities had preserved across centuries a body of manuscript material that included theological works, biblical commentaries, and texts that drew on the cosmological traditions of the older Mesopotamian world filtered through Jewish and early Christian interpretive frameworks. When Maronite scholars began arriving in Rome in the 16th century to study at the newly founded Maronite College, they brought with them knowledge of and access to manuscript traditions that the Latin West had not previously encountered directly, and the Vatican Library's Syriac collection grew substantially during this period through purchase, donation, and the copying of manuscripts brought to Rome by these scholars. The Coptic materials in the Vatican's collection trace a similarly complex path from their origins in the monasteries of Egypt, where communities of Christian monks had preserved ancient texts in the Coptic language, descended from ancient Egyptian, in the remote desert settlements of the Nile Valley and the Libyan Desert. The monastery of St. Catherine at the foot of Mount Sinai, though technically outside Egypt proper, is among the institutions that contributed to the movement of ancient manuscript materials toward Rome across the medieval and early modern periods, and the Vatican's collection of Coptic texts includes materials that preserve, sometimes in fragmentary form, traditions with roots in Egyptian religious thought that had been in dialogue with Mesopotamian cosmology for centuries before the Christian era began. A Coptic manuscript copied by a monk in a desert cell in the 5th century might contain, embedded within a Christian theological framework, echoes of ideas that had first been written down in Sumerian on clay tablets 3,000 years earlier. The Renaissance papacy pursued manuscript acquisition with an enthusiasm that was partly theological, partly political, and partly the expression of a genuine scholarly culture that flourished in the Roman Church during the 15th and 16th centuries. Papal agents were stationed in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the communities of the Jewish diaspora, with instructions to identify and acquire texts that were not already represented in the Vatican's collection, and the funds directed toward these acquisitions were substantial. The library that resulted from this sustained effort was understood by those who built it not merely as a practical resource for scholars, but as a statement about the Church's relationship to all of human knowledge, a claim that the institution in Rome stood at the convergence point of every significant intellectual tradition that human civilization had produced, and that its archive was therefore the appropriate custodian of everything worth keeping. There is a particular category of acquisition that the historical record touches on with a delicacy that itself seems meaningful. When the Church moved against movements it deemed heretical, across the medieval and early modern periods, the libraries of those movements were frequently seized along with their other assets, and the texts contained in those libraries did not always end up destroyed. Some were examined, judged, and then placed in restricted sections of institutional archives rather than committed to the fires that consumed other materials associated with the same communities. The logic of this preservation, where it can be reconstructed from surviving administrative records, seems to have been that understanding the nature of a tradition required keeping its texts available for study, even when the tradition itself had been condemned. What remained in those restricted sections was not made freely available, but it was kept, and keeping is its own kind of statement about the value assigned to what is being kept. The manuscripts that crossed deserts and centuries to arrive in the rooms of the Vatican Library brought with them, embedded in their pages, the accumulated questions of every civilization that had handled them along the way. They carry the fingerprints, sometimes literally, of scholars in Alexandria and Constantinople, of monks in the deserts of Egypt and Syria, of merchants who understood that certain texts were worth more than their weight in tradable goods, of priests who carried them inside their robes across mountain passes when the roads behind them were already burning. Each text that arrived in Rome was the survivor of a journey whose full itinerary will never be completely known, and each one added its particular silence to the silence of the rooms that received it. The men who shaped the theological foundations of early Christianity were, before they were theologians, readers. They were educated in the classical tradition of the late Roman world, trained in rhetoric, philosophy, and the close analysis of texts, and they came to their religious vocation carrying with them a familiarity with the full range of cosmological thinking available in the intellectually crowded cities of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. Alexandria, Carthage, Antioch, and Rome were cities where Platonic philosophy, Jewish mystical tradition, Gnostic cosmology, Zoroastrian ideas carried westward by Persian communities, and the older Near Eastern narratives that had been circulating in Greek and Aramaic translation for generations all coexisted in a state of productive and often contentious dialogue. The scholars who became the Church Fathers did not encounter the ancient cosmological traditions from a position of ignorance. They encountered them as educated contemporaries who had read widely and who understood exactly what they were engaging with. Tertullian, who wrote in Carthage in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries of the Common Era, and who was among the earliest and most vigorous of the Latin Church Fathers, engaged directly with the tradition of the Watchers as preserved in the Enochic literature. His surviving writings include extended discussions of the angels who descended and intermingled with humanity, and he treats the Book of Enoch as a text of genuine antiquity and legitimate authority, arguing for its credibility on the grounds that its preservation in the tradition demonstrated its divine inspiration. Tertullian used the Watcher narrative specifically to explain the origin of the arts of personal adornment, cosmetics, jewellery, and the dyeing of cloth, tracing these practices to the forbidden knowledge transmitted by the descending beings as a way of grounding his theological argument about the proper conduct of Christian women in a cosmological narrative that went back, in his understanding, to the earliest interactions between the divine and the human worlds. He was not treating the Anunnaki tradition as myth or metaphor. He was treating it as history. Origen of Alexandria, who wrote in the first half of the 3rd century, and who was among the most intellectually ambitious of all the Church Fathers, engaged with the ancient cosmological traditions at a level of philosophical depth that his successors found both admirable and troubling. Origen was deeply influenced by Platonic thought, and his theological writings attempted to synthesize the Christian scriptural tradition with Greek philosophical frameworks in ways that sometimes produced conclusions that later church councils would judge as incompatible with orthodox doctrine. His engagement with the tradition of divine beings who inhabited different levels of a hierarchically ordered cosmos, beings with varying degrees of proximity to the divine source and varying relationships to the material world, drew on a conceptual framework that had clear structural parallels with the Mesopotamian cosmological tradition, in which the Anunnaki occupied a specific position in a carefully ranked hierarchy of divine authorities governing different domains of existence. Origen's cosmology was eventually condemned as heretical, but his writings were not destroyed. They were preserved, argued with, and returned to by subsequent generations of theologians who found in them questions they could not quite dismiss. Justin Martyr, writing in Rome in the middle of the 2nd century, offered one of the earliest systematic Christian interpretations of the descending beings tradition, identifying the fallen angels of the Anunnaki narrative with the gods of the Greek and Roman pantheon, and arguing that the religious practices of the pagan world were the corrupted legacy of the knowledge transmitted by these beings during their unauthorized time on Earth. This interpretive move was significant because it did not dismiss the ancient traditions as simple fabrication. It acknowledged their reality, their antiquity, and their continuing influence, and it located them within a theological framework that assigned them a specific origin and a specific meaning. The gods that the Greeks and Romans worshipped in Justin's account were real beings, but their reality was not what their worshippers believed it to be. They were the descendants or the residue of an ancient intervention, and the knowledge associated with them was genuine but corrupted, real but dangerous. Clement of Alexandria, a near contemporary of Tertullian who wrote at the end of the 2nd century, took a somewhat different approach that is in some ways more remarkable for its openness. Clement was deeply learned in Greek philosophy and in the Jewish Hellenistic tradition, and his writings show a scholar attempting to synthesize the wisdom of the ancient world, including traditions that his more cautious contemporaries regarded with suspicion, into a comprehensive Christian intellectual framework. He engaged with the Enochic tradition, and with texts that drew on older Mesopotamian cosmological material, and his attitude toward this material was less one of condemnation than of incorporation. A careful attempt to find within the ancient accounts of divine beings and their interactions with humanity something that could be read as anticipating or complementing the Christian understanding of the relationship between the heavens and the earth. His approach was scholarly in the deepest sense, patient, curious, and unwilling to dismiss what the evidence of ancient tradition suggested simply because it was uncomfortable. What these writers shared, despite their significant differences in temperament and theological approach, was a seriousness about the ancient traditions that is sometimes difficult to recover fully from behind the institutional positions their writings later came to represent. They were not reading the Book of Enoch or engaging with the traditions of descending divine beings as a form of intellectual entertainment or as an exercise in understanding what they intended to refute. They were reading these texts because they believed they described something real, something that had actually happened in the deep past of the world, and because they understood that any adequate account of the human condition and its relationship to the divine order needed to reckon with what those ancient accounts contained. The question of what the beings described in those texts were, what they had done, and what the consequences of their actions continued to be for the world their readers inhabited was not an abstract theological puzzle. It was a live question about the nature of reality. The theological settlements reached by the church councils of the 4th and 5th centuries did not resolve these questions so much as they deferred them, placing certain texts outside the canon, ruling certain speculative positions incompatible with orthodox doctrine, and redirecting the intellectual energy of subsequent generations of Christian scholars toward frameworks that had less room for the kind of cosmic ambiguity that the Enochic tradition and the older cosmologies behind it tended to generate. but the writings of the Church Fathers who had engaged most directly with these traditions were preserved, copied across the medieval centuries in the same scriptoria that copied the approved canonical texts, and the questions their engagement with the ancient cosmologies had raised were never entirely closed. They passed into the archive alongside everything else, patient and unresolved, waiting in the particular silence of texts that have been kept but not answered. There is a particular kind of disappearance that is not quite the same as destruction. When a text is burned, it is gone, and the loss is clean, if devastating. But when a text is excluded, ruled out of bounds, moved from the category of things that are read and discussed to the category of things that are not recommended, it does not cease to exist. It retreats. It finds shelter in communities that made different decisions about what to keep close, in libraries at the edges of the world, where the councils that shaped the mainstream tradition did not reach with the same force, in the hands of readers who continued to find in its pages something the approved text did not quite contain. The Book of Enoch did not die when the Western Church set it aside. It simply went to Ethiopia, and it waited there for 14 centuries with the patience that ancient texts seem, in retrospect, to have possessed in abundance. The Council of Laodicea, a regional church council held in the city of Laodicea in what is now Western Turkey, around the year 363 of the Common Era, produced among its canons a list of books considered acceptable for reading in Christian churches. The Book of Enoch was not on that list. The council's decision was not a universal or immediately binding one, but it reflected a direction in which the developing institutional church was already moving, toward a more tightly defined canon that excluded the more speculative and cosmologically expansive texts that had circulated widely in the earlier centuries of the Christian movement. Subsequent councils and influential theologians reinforced this direction, and as the authority of Rome and of the councils it convened solidified, across the following centuries, the Book of Enoch faded from the active reading culture of Western Christianity, with a thoroughness that made it, for most European scholars by the medieval period, a text known only by reputation and by the references to it, preserved in the writings of the Church Fathers who had engaged with it before its exclusion. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church followed a different path. The Christianity that reached the kingdom of Aksum in the 4th century of the Common Era took root in a culture with its own ancient traditions and its own scholarly infrastructure, and the Ethiopian Church developed a biblical canon that was both broader and in some respects more inclusive than the canons adopted by the Latin West or the Greek East. The Book of Enoch was included in the Ethiopian canon and remained there, copied and recopied across the centuries in the monasteries of the Ethiopian highlands, read as scripture, integrated into the theological and liturgical life of a church that maintained its continuous existence through periods when much of the surrounding world was undergoing transformations that disrupted older traditions. The monks who copied the Book of Enoch in their highland monasteries were not preserving a forbidden text. They were copying scripture, the same way their counterparts in European scriptoria were copying the Psalms or the Gospels, with the same careful attention and the same sense of sacred obligation. The text that survived in Ethiopia was not identical to what the earliest authors had written, because no text that passes through 14 centuries of hand copying in multiple languages emerges unchanged. The oldest portions of the Book of Enoch were composed in Aramaic, and fragments of this Aramaic original were among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1947, providing a check against which later versions could be compared. An intermediate Greek translation had existed in antiquity and was known to the Church Fathers who quoted from it, but this Greek version was lost in the West. What survived in Ethiopia was a translation into the Ge'ez language, the classical literary language of the Ethiopian Church, made sometime in the early centuries of Ethiopian Christianity, and it is this Ge'ez version that James Bruce encountered when he travelled to Ethiopia in the 1760s, on a journey whose ostensible purpose was to find the source of the Blue Nile. James Bruce was a Scottish traveller and explorer of considerable personal courage and considerable self-regard. A tall, red-haired man who had educated himself in Arabic, and who approached the challenges of long-distance travel in the 18th century with a combination of physical endurance and aristocratic confidence that carried him through situations that would have ended the journeys of less determined men. He arrived in Ethiopia in 1769, spent approximately 2 years in the country, and when he departed he carried with him 3 manuscript copies of the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez, which he had obtained in the city of Gondar. Bruce understood the significance of what he was carrying. He deposited one copy in the Bibliothèque du Roi in Paris, gave one to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and kept one for himself. Europe, after 14 centuries, had the Book of Enoch back in its hands. The scholarly world's response to Bruce's discovery was initially muted, partly because the Jayas language was not widely known among European scholars, and partly because Bruce himself, when he described the manuscript in the published account of his travels, was met with skepticism from readers who doubted that the text he was describing was what he claimed it was. The translation into English that eventually made the book's contents accessible to a broad readership was completed by Richard Lawrence, an Oxford theologian and Hebrew scholar who published his rendering in 1821, nearly 50 years after Bruce had brought the manuscripts out of Ethiopia. Lawrence approached the text with the careful restraint of a scholar uncertain of its ultimate provenance and theological status, but the contents he translated were unmistakable in their significance. Here was an ancient text describing named divine beings who descended to the earth, transmitted forbidden knowledge to humanity, and whose actions set in motion the catastrophic flood that reset the ancient world, written in detail and with a specificity that the brief references in the canonical Hebrew Bible had entirely suppressed. The return of the Book of Enoch to Western scholarly awareness in the early 19th century coincided with the period when the first cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia were beginning to arrive in European museums, carried back by diplomats and travellers from the ruins of cities whose names had been forgotten for 2,000 years. The connections between the Enochic Watcher tradition and the older Mesopotamian narratives that were gradually becoming readable as scholars worked to decode the cuneiform script were not immediately apparent, because the decipherment of cuneiform was itself a slow process that extended across most of the 19th century. But as both bodies of material became more accessible, the structural parallels became harder to ignore, and the question that the Church Fathers had engaged with in the 2nd and 3rd centuries returned with renewed force to the desks of scholars working in the libraries of a world that had changed enormously since the text had last been widely read. The Book of Enoch had waited. It had come back, and the questions it carried had not grown simpler in the interval. On a clear night in the hills southeast of Rome, in the town of Castel Gandolfo, where the papal summer residence sits above the ancient volcanic lake of Albano, there is a dome that opens to the sky. It is not a large dome by the standards of modern astronomical observatories, and the equipment it once housed has long since been surpassed in raw power by instruments stationed on remote mountaintops or launched into orbit above the atmosphere. But the institution that operates it is something that no mountaintop observatory and no space telescope can claim to be, which is among the oldest continuously operating astronomical research institutions in the Western world, with a documented history of sky watching that extends back, in various forms, to the 16th century. The Vatican Observatory, known in Italian as the Specula Vaticana, is a real scientific institution staffed by working researchers, and its existence raises a question that its own directors have addressed publicly and at length without quite exhausting it, which is why a spiritual institution concerned with the salvation of souls has maintained, across 5 centuries of institutional continuity, such a persistent and well-resourced interest in the precise movements of celestial bodies. The roots of the Vatican's formal engagement with astronomy reach back to the calendar reform of 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII convened a commission of astronomers and mathematicians to address the accumulated drift between the Julian calendar, introduced under Julius Caesar, and the actual length of the solar year. The commission's work resulted in the Gregorian calendar that most of the world uses today, a reform that required precise astronomical observation and calculation to implement correctly. And to support this work, a new tower was constructed within the Vatican walls specifically for astronomical observation. The Torre dei Venti, the Tower of the Winds, still stands within the Vatican complex, and its upper room, decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting wind gods and cartographic subjects, contains a meridian line cut into the floor through which a shaft of sunlight passes at solar noon, allowing precise determination of the solstices and equinoxes that the calendar reform required. The institution that produced the Gregorian calendar was not dabbling in astronomy. It was doing serious, consequential scientific work. The formal establishment of what became the Vatican Observatory as a distinct scientific institution came in 1891, when Pope Leo XIII issued a decree creating the Specula Vaticana and articulating with unusual directness the reasons for its creation. Leo XIII was concerned, the decree makes clear, with the perception that the Church was hostile to science, a perception that the affair of Galileo Galilei, nearly 3 centuries earlier, had embedded deeply in European intellectual culture, and that the Church had not yet fully dislodged. The observatory was intended in part as a statement, a demonstration in institutional form that the Church did not fear the sky, and did not regard the investigation of natural phenomena as incompatible with religious faith. The Jesuit astronomers who staffed it from an early period brought to their work the same combination of rigorous intellectual training and religious vocation that the Society of Jesus had cultivated since its founding in the 16th century, and their publications in peer-reviewed astronomical journals established the observatory's credibility within the mainstream scientific community. The move of the observatory's primary operations from the Vatican itself to Castel Gandolfo in 1935 was driven by a problem that any astronomer would recognize: the growing light pollution of Rome, which by the middle of the 20th century had made serious optical observation from within the city effectively impossible. The domes at Castel Gandolfo housed telescopes of genuine research quality, and the Jesuit astronomers who worked there across the following decades produced contributions to the study of stellar classification, meteor spectroscopy, and other fields that are documented in the scientific literature of the period. The observatory also developed a significant meteorite collection, one of the larger such collections in the world, which became an important resource for researchers studying the early history of the solar system. These are not the activities of an institution maintaining a superficial connection to science for appearance's sake. They are the activities of working scientists who happen to wear clerical collars. The further relocation of the observatory's primary research operations to the Mount Graham International Observatory in Arizona, which was completed in the early 1990s, brought the Vatican into partnership with the University of Arizona and other research institutions in the operation of what became known as the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, a 1.8-meter instrument designed for infrared and optical observation, situated at an altitude of over 3,200 meters on a mountain in the Pinaleno Range. The choice of location was driven entirely by the practical requirements of modern astronomical research, the need for high altitude, low humidity, and the dark skies that the American Southwest provides, and the telescope's scientific program has focused on topics including the study of near-Earth objects, stellar populations, and the search for planetary systems around other stars. Brother Guy Consolmagno, who served for many years as a Vatican astronomer and later as the director of the observatory, has spoken and written publicly about the relationship between his scientific work and his religious vocation with a candour and a thoughtfulness that has made him one of the more recognised public voices on the question of how faith and scientific inquiry relate to one another. Consolmagno and his colleagues at the Vatican Observatory have also engaged publicly with the question that inevitably arises when a religious institution maintains an astronomical research program, which is the question of what the discovery of life elsewhere in the universe or evidence of other intelligent beings would mean for Christian theology. The observatory's own directors have addressed this question in published interviews and in a book co-authored by Consolmagno and another Vatican astronomer, and their answers have been notably thoughtful and notably undefensive, acknowledging that the theological implications of such a discovery would require serious engagement, while maintaining that Christian faith was not inherently threatened by the possibility. The willingness of Vatican astronomers to address this question directly, in print and in public, is itself significant, because it suggests that the institution has considered the question carefully enough to have developed positions on it rather than simply hoping it would not arise. The long arc of the Vatican's relationship with astronomy, from the Torre dei Venti and the Gregorian calendar reform through the Specula Vaticana at Castel Gandolfo and the telescope on Mount Graham, is a story about an institution that has never been willing to simply turn its back on the sky. The Sumerian priests who maintained astronomical records in the temple complexes of Nippur and Ur, and the Jesuit astronomers who calibrate their instruments in the cold pre-dawn darkness of an Arizona mountain, are separated by 5,000 years of history and by the full width of the conceptual distance between ancient religion and modern science. And yet something in the posture is recognizable across that distance: the same upward orientation, the same careful attention to what the sky contains, the same institutional commitment to ensuring that whatever is up there is being watched. The reasons given for that watching have changed across the centuries. The watching itself has not. Names carry weight. They always have, in every culture that has ever assigned them carefully, which is to say every culture without exception, because the naming of a thing is one of the oldest human acts of definition, a way of drawing a boundary around something and declaring what it is and what it belongs to. The people who named instruments and institutions in the ancient world understood this, and the priests who gave the stars their names in the temple courtyards of Mesopotamia were doing something they regarded as consequential, not merely convenient. The people who named a large near-infrared spectrograph and imager mounted on the Large Binocular Telescope on Mount Graham in Arizona may have been thinking primarily about acronyms, about the satisfying engineering logic of fitting a long technical description into a short, memorable string of letters. But the name they produced, and the institution that operated the telescope alongside them, created a confluence that moved well beyond the astronomy community and into a much wider conversation about what the Vatican was doing on that particular mountain, with that particular instrument pointed at that particular sky. The instrument in question was developed by a consortium of German institutions, including the Max Planck Institute for Extraterrestrial Physics and several German universities, and its technical name was the Large Binocular Telescope Near-Infrared Spectroscopic Utility, with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research. The acronym derived from that name is Lucifer, and it was the name under which the instrument was publicly known for several years after its commissioning on the Large Binocular Telescope in 2010. The Large Binocular Telescope itself is a collaborative project involving multiple institutions, among them the Vatican Observatory Research Group, which is the research arm of the Vatican Observatory, operating in partnership with the University of Arizona. The Vatican's involvement in the telescope's operation is documented, institutional, and straightforwardly scientific in its stated purpose, a continuation of the observatory's transition to American facilities that had been underway since the 1990s. None of this was secret. All of it was publicly available in the observatory's own publications and in the scientific literature of the collaboration. The public attention generated by the combination of the Vatican's name and the instrument's name was, from the perspective of the scientists involved, an unwelcome distraction from work they regarded as serious and methodologically rigorous. Brother Guy Consolmagno and other Vatican astronomers addressed the matter in interviews with a mixture of patience and mild exasperation, explaining that the acronym had been assigned by German engineers and that its resonance with a particular theological tradition was, from a scientific standpoint, simply an unfortunate collision of nomenclature with cultural history. The instrument was subsequently renamed Leuci, a change that may have been motivated partly by the desire to reduce what one astronomer described as the unnecessary noise surrounding what was, at its core, a piece of scientific equipment designed to study the formation of stars and the structure of distant galaxies. The scientific publications that resulted from observations made with the instrument are available in the astronomical literature and deal with topics including stellar populations in the galactic center and the properties of high redshift galaxies, subjects that are at considerable remove from ancient cosmology. And yet the episode is worth sitting with for a moment, not because it reveals anything conspiratorial, but because it illustrates something true about the way that certain combinations of facts produce resonances that exceed the intentions of the people involved in creating them. The Vatican Observatory is a real scientific institution doing real scientific work, and its presence on Mount Graham alongside instruments like the one briefly named Lucifer was the outcome of a series of practical decisions about telescope location and institutional partnership, rather than the expression of any hidden agenda. This is what the evidence shows, and it is the responsible account of what actually happened. But the fact that a religious institution with a 5-century history of astronomical observation, operating from a mountain site also used by an instrument bearing that particular name, found itself at the centre of widespread public speculation says something about the depth of the cultural substrate from which that speculation drew its energy. That substrate is the accumulated weight of the traditions we have been following through this account, the Sumerian narratives of divine beings associated with particular stars and planets, the Enochic literature describing the transmission of astronomical knowledge by descending beings, the Church Fathers wrestling with the implications of those traditions, and the long institutional history of an organization that has watched the sky continuously since before the invention of the telescope. When people encountered the fact of Vatican astronomers operating alongside an instrument named Lucifer, they were not responding to that fact in isolation. They were responding to it against the background of everything they carried about the relationship between ancient cosmological traditions and the institution in Rome, and that background gave the fact a charge it would not have had without it. The response was, in this sense, a measure of how much unresolved material the older traditions still carry in the cultural memory of the modern world. The Large Binocular Telescope on Mount Graham is also involved in the search for near-Earth objects, asteroids and comets, whose orbits bring them into proximity with our planet, and this aspect of its scientific program is documented in its published research outputs. Near-Earth object monitoring is a field that has grown substantially in institutional seriousness over the past several decades, as the scientific community has developed a clearer picture of the frequency and potential consequences of significant impacts. The Vatican Observatory's participation in telescope operations that contribute to this monitoring is, again, a straightforward scientific matter. But the image of Jesuit astronomers participating in the systematic surveillance of objects approaching the Earth from deep space, operating instruments on a mountain in Arizona under a sky that the Sumerian astronomers also watched and catalogued with their own careful methods 4,000 years ago, has a quality that resists reduction to the purely technical, not because anything mystical is occurring, but because the continuity of the act, the watching, the recording, the attention directed upward at what approaches from the darkness beyond the atmosphere, is genuinely very old. What the scholars said, when pressed to address the Lucifer episode directly, was measured and clear. The instrument was named by engineers following a standard acronym generation process. The Vatican's involvement with the telescope was a continuation of its long scientific mission. The name was changed to reduce confusion. The science continued. These are the facts, and they deserve to be stated plainly and kept separate from the layers of interpretation that the episode attracted. But facts exist within contexts, and the context here is one of the longest and most consistently documented relationships between a single institution and the observation of the sky that the historical record contains. The instrument has a new name now. The mountain remains. The sky above it is the same sky that has always been there, patient and full of objects whose nature and trajectories the careful and the curious have been attempting to determine for as long as human beings have thought it worth the effort to look up. Every great cosmological tradition that has survived long enough to leave a written record contains, somewhere within it, a structure of departure and return. The gods withdraw. The golden age ends. The beings who once walked among humanity ascend or retreat, or are driven back to wherever they came from, and the world they leave behind carries the memory of their presence in its rituals, its architecture, its calendar systems, and its recurring dreams of a time when the distance between the divine and the human was smaller than it is now. This structure is not the invention of any single culture. It appears with enough consistency across traditions that are geographically and temporally separated to suggest that it answers something deep in the way human consciousness processes the experience of living in a world that feels, to those who pay attention to the oldest accounts, somehow diminished from what it once was. The Sumerians had a name for the era before the flood, the time when the Anunnaki walked among the first cities. They called it, in various texts, the time when kingship descended from heaven, and they understood everything that followed as an attempt to maintain contact with a presence that had, for reasons the texts circle around without fully explaining, chosen to step back. The Sumerian king lists, which survive in several versions recovered from sites across Mesopotamia, describe a sequence of rulers before the flood whose reigns lasted for tens of thousands of years each. Numbers so far outside human biological possibility that scholars interpret them as mythological rather than historical in the literal sense. But what the king lists record, alongside these extraordinary reign lengths, is a cosmological claim about the nature of early human governance, namely that the authority to rule descended from the sky, was exercised on Earth for a period of immense duration, and then was interrupted by the flood before being restored in a diminished form through the post-flood dynasties, whose reigns are measured in centuries and decades rather than tens of millennia. The structure is one of a long golden proximity followed by catastrophic interruption, followed by imperfect restoration, and the Anunnaki figure in this structure as the beings who established the original order, withdrew from direct governance, and left behind institutions, temples, and astronomical knowledge as the tools through which the connection might be partially maintained. The Babylonian astronomical tradition, which developed out of the older Sumerian priestly practices and reached its most sophisticated expression in the first millennium before the Common Era, was organized around a concept that scholars translate as the Great Year or the cosmic cycle, the idea that the movements of celestial bodies followed patterns of such immense duration that their full cycles were measurable only in thousands of years. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the position of the Sun at the spring equinox to shift gradually through the constellations over a period of approximately 26,000 years, was known to Babylonian astronomers and was incorporated into their understanding of cosmic time. Within this framework, certain alignments and configurations of celestial bodies were understood as markers of significant transitions in the great cycles, moments when the relationship between the heavens and the earth shifted in ways that had consequences for the human world below. The priests who maintained these records were not astrologers in the trivial modern sense. They were custodians of a temporal framework in which the return of certain conditions in the sky corresponded, according to the tradition they preserved, with transformations in the order of things on earth. The Enochic literature engages with this cyclical framework in ways that connect it directly to the Watcher tradition. The Book of Enoch contains, in addition to its narrative of the descending beings and the flood, extended astronomical and calendrical sections that describe the movements of the sun and moon, the structure of the heavenly realms through which Enoch travels, and a system of cosmic time organized around periods whose completion triggers transformations in the relationship between the divine and the human worlds. Scholars who study these sections carefully note their debt to Babylonian astronomical tradition, and some have argued that the Enochic calendrical material represents a specifically Jewish engagement with the Babylonian cosmic cycle framework, translated into a theological vocabulary centered on divine judgment and the eventual restoration of right order. The pattern in the Enochic texts is consistent with the older Mesopotamian structure, a departure of the divine presence from direct engagement with the human world, a period of diminished contact maintained through prophetic intermediaries and preserved texts, and an eventual return whose timing is encoded in the movements of the heavenly bodies that the ancient astronomers tracked with such persistent care. The Christian tradition absorbed this cyclical structure through multiple channels: the Hebrew prophetic literature with its recurring themes of exile and return, the apocalyptic text that circulated in Jewish communities in the centuries around the Common Era, and the direct engagement of early Christian thinkers with the Enochic and related materials. The Book of Revelation, the final text of the Christian New Testament canon, is structured around a series of cosmic cycles and celestial events that culminate in the descent of a new Jerusalem from the sky, a return of divine presence to the earth that explicitly mirrors, in its structural logic, the older Mesopotamian pattern of departure and return. The theological interpretation placed on this structure by mainstream Christian tradition differs fundamentally from the Sumerian or Babylonian understanding of what such cycles meant, but the underlying architecture, the sky descent, the terrestrial transformation, the restored relationship between the heavenly and the earthly realms, is recognizably the same. What's perhaps most striking when one surveys the full breadth of these traditions with appropriate scholarly caution is not any single parallel but the consistency of the structural expectation across such different cultural and temporal contexts. The Sumerian scribe recording the king lists in 2300 before the Common Era, the Babylonian astronomer calculating the precessional cycle in 600 before the Common Era, the Jewish author of the Enochic astronomical sections in 200 before the Common Era, and the Christian visionary composing the Book of Revelation in the 1st century of the Common Era were all working within a framework that understood cosmic time as cyclical, that located humanity in a period of partial separation from a divine order that had once been more immediately present, and that anticipated, on the basis of celestial indicators, a future return to closer contact. The institution that has held the text of all these traditions within its archive for centuries has had, if it chose to read them together, an unusually complete view of this structural pattern and of the question it persistently raises. Years passed after each of these traditions set down its version of the return, then centuries. The astronomical cycles the Babylonians calculated continued their patient revolutions regardless of whether anyone was still measuring them, and the tablets and manuscripts that recorded the expectation of return accumulated in the archives of the institutions that chose to preserve them. The pattern does not resolve itself by being written down. It simply waits, the way patterns do, for the moment when the conditions it describes come around again in the long turning of the sky. Time, for the Mesopotamian astronomer, was not an abstraction. It was a substance with texture and direction, organised into layers of nested cycles that moved at different speeds and governed different aspects of the world's behaviour, the way that seasons govern the flooding of rivers and the ripening of grain, but extended outward through orders of magnitude that the human lifespan could measure only in fractions. A farmer in the fields outside Nippur understood the agricultural year, the planting season and the harvest, the months marked by the lunar calendar that the temple priests maintained and announced with the lighting of ceremonial fires. A merchant understood the slightly longer rhythms of the market festivals and the intercity trade fairs that followed the agricultural calendar. A scribe in the temple trained for years to understand the cycles of the planets, the regular return of Jupiter to a particular position in the stars, the longer and more complex patterns of Saturn, and the very slow drift of the equinoctial point through the background of fixed stars that no single human lifetime was long enough to measure from beginning to end. Each of these cycles was understood as real and consequential, and the priest astronomers who tracked them understood their work as a form of listening, an attempt to read in the sky's movements, a text that had been written before the first cities were built. The Babylonian astronomical tradition that grew from these Sumerian roots reached a level of mathematical sophistication that continues to draw the respect of historians of science. By the first millennium before the Common Era, Babylonian astronomers had developed methods for predicting the positions of the sun, moon, and visible planets, with an accuracy that required no geometric model of the solar system, only the patient accumulation and mathematical analysis of observational records extending back centuries. Their prediction methods, preserved in cuneiform tablets that scholars have analysed in detail since the 19th century, used arithmetic sequences to model the varying speeds of celestial bodies, and the results they achieved were accurate enough to predict lunar eclipses and the first appearances of planets on the horizon, with a reliability that served both the practical needs of the calendar and the interpretive needs of the astrological tradition that ran alongside the purely observational one. These were not primitive sky watchers. They were skilled mathematical astronomers whose work influenced Greek astronomy, and, through it, the entire subsequent development of Western science. At the foundation of this astronomical tradition lay the concept of the Saros, a cycle of approximately 18 years and 11 days, after which the pattern of lunar and solar eclipses repeats with sufficient regularity to allow prediction. Babylonian astronomers had identified the Saros by at least the 7th century before the Common Era, and their eclipse prediction records, preserved in a series of tablets known as the astronomical diaries, document observations going back to at least 747 before the Common Era, the first year of the reign of the Babylonian king Nabonassar, which the astronomers apparently chose as a convenient epoch for their long-term records. The discipline required to maintain observational records across generations, each observer contributing their measurements to a running archive that would only become fully useful centuries later, reflects an institutional commitment to long-term temporal accounting that has few parallels in the ancient world. Beyond the Saros and the planetary cycles lay the concept of the Great Year, the period required for all the celestial bodies to return simultaneously to the same configuration they had occupied at some defined starting point. The Babylonians calculated versions of this period, and the number they worked with most extensively in their cosmological and astrological literature was a figure of 432,000 years, a number that appears with striking consistency across Babylonian, Hindu, and other ancient cosmological systems, and that scholars have analysed in depth without reaching a consensus on whether its recurrence reflects shared observation, shared mathematical tradition, or independent parallel development. This number, 432,000, is also the sum of the reign lengths in the Sumerian king list for the period before the flood, a fact that has attracted considerable scholarly attention because it suggests that the king list's apparently mythological numbers may encode in a form that required substantial mathematical work to extract, a deliberate reference to the Great Year calculation. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow westward drift of the equinoctial point through the zodiac caused by the wobble of the Earth's rotational axis, takes approximately 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. This number, or close approximations of it, appears in Babylonian astronomical records in ways that suggest the phenomenon was known to the temple astronomers, though the extent and precision of their knowledge of precession has been a matter of scholarly debate. What is clear from the surviving records is that Babylonian astronomers tracked the slow movement of the equinoctial point with enough consistency to document its direction and rough rate over periods extending across several centuries of observation. The astrological tradition that ran alongside the purely predictive astronomical work assigned specific qualities and associations to each of these zodiacal positions through which the equinoctial point moved across the great precessional cycle, and the transition from one zodiacal age to the next was understood as a significant cosmic event, a turning of the great wheel that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, with implications for the human world that the priestly interpreters of these cycles had spent generations attempting to specify. The question of where the present moment falls within these ancient cycles is one that has been addressed by scholars, independent researchers, and writers working at the intersection of ancient astronomy and contemporary cultural interpretation, with results that vary considerably in rigour and in the conclusions they reach. The mainstream academic position is appropriately cautious, noting that the ancient cycle calculations involved assumptions and conventions that do not map cleanly onto modern astronomical measurements, and that the assignment of specific contemporary significance to ancient cycle endpoints requires interpretive steps that go well beyond what the evidence strictly supports. This caution is responsible and necessary, and yet the scholars who have examined the Babylonian astronomical tradition most closely are also the ones most likely to acknowledge the genuine sophistication of what the ancient astronomers achieved and the genuine depth of the temporal framework they constructed, a framework in which the present moment is always located somewhere within a set of nested cycles whose outer boundaries extend so far beyond the human scale that the entire recorded history of civilization occupies only a small fraction of the outermost ring. The temple priests of Nippur, who maintained the astronomical records that eventually contributed to the Babylonian tradition, were not, in their own understanding, simply tracking the sky for the practical benefits of an accurate calendar. They were reading a text that they believed had been given to humanity at the beginning of the present era, a text written in the movements of celestial bodies by beings whose understanding of time operated at scales that dwarfed the human. The tablets they filled with their observations and calculations were, in their own conception of what they were doing, correspondence with that original gift, an attempt to demonstrate across the slow years of patient measurement that humanity had understood what it had been given and had kept the record faithfully. Whether anyone was receiving that correspondence across the distance of whatever the ancient priests understood as the sky, the record was kept and it survives, and the cycles it documents continue to turn in the dark above whatever roof you are resting beneath tonight. There is a specific quality of unease that serious scholars sometimes describe when they encounter, in the course of work they approached with conventional academic expectations, a convergence they had not anticipated and cannot easily dismiss. It is not the unease of discovering something frightening. It is more restrained than that, closer to the feeling of finding that two separate threads of evidence, followed independently through different archives in different languages across different periods, arrive at the same point without having been guided there by anything other than the logic of the evidence itself. Scholars are trained to be cautious about such convergences, to test them against alternative explanations, to resist the pull of pattern recognition that the human mind is prone to, and to publish conclusions with the hedging language that peer review requires. And yet the convergences that have emerged from the serious comparative study of Mesopotamian, Enochic, and early Christian cosmological traditions have accumulated across the past century and a half of scholarship, to a degree that the most rigorous researchers acknowledge, even when they are careful about what conclusions they will allow themselves to draw from the acknowledgement. The recovery of the cuneiform tablets from Nineveh and Nippur in the second half of the 19th century initiated the first wave of these convergences. When the Assyriologist George Smith announced to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London in 1872 that he had found, among the Nineveh tablets in the British Museum, a Babylonian flood narrative that corresponded in striking structural detail to the flood account in the Book of Genesis, the response in both the scholarly and the religious communities was intense and lasting. Smith's translation of what became known as the Gilgamesh Flood Tablet revealed that the biblical flood narrative shared with its Babylonian counterpart Not merely the general outline of a divinely sent deluge survived by one righteous man and his family, but specific details, the construction of a vessel to specific proportions, the release of birds to test for receding waters, the vessel coming to rest on a mountain, the divine promise that the flood would not be repeated. The convergence was too detailed to be coincidental, and the scholarly and theological work of explaining its significance has continued without reaching a settled conclusion from Smith's announcement to the present day. The comparative study of the Watcher tradition in the Book of Enoch and the Anunnaki, narratives of the Sumerian and Babylonian texts, produced a second wave of convergences as the 20th century scholarship on both bodies of material deepened. Researchers working on the Enochic texts noted that the specific knowledge attributed to the descending Watchers, astronomical observation, the working of metals, the preparation of medicinal and harmful substances, and the arts of writing and record-keeping, corresponded with remarkable precision to the gifts attributed to the Anunnaki in the Mesopotamian tradition, where these same skills are described as the gifts of civilization brought down from the divine realm and established in the first cities. The list of correspondences extended beyond the general to the specific, the organization of the descending beings into ranked groups, the assignment of individual beings to particular domains of knowledge, and the structural role of a flood as the event that separated the age of direct divine human contact from the diminished present. Scholars who published on these convergences were careful to frame them as evidence of cultural transmission and shared literary tradition rather than as evidence of literal historical events, and that framing is the responsible one. The convergences themselves, however, were real. The institutional dimension of these convergences has received less systematic scholarly attention than the textual one, but it is not without documentation. The Vatican's engagement with the ancient Near Eastern manuscript tradition, across the centuries of its archive's growth, meant that the institution possessed, at various points in its history, access to materials that place the Mesopotamian, Enochic, and Christian cosmological traditions in proximity to one another within a single reading environment. The Jesuit scholars who staffed both the Vatican Library and the Vatican Observatory across the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries were, in many cases, men of genuine and broad learning who read across linguistic and textual traditions with a facility that was the product of the Society of Jesus' demanding intellectual formation. Whether any of them produced internal analyses of the convergences between the ancient cosmological traditions they encountered in the library's holdings and the astronomical records they maintained in the observatory's operations is a question that the institutional archive could in principle answer, though it has not been asked in any systematic way that has produced published results accessible to outside researchers. The 20th century produced several scholars whose work brought them, through different routes, to a serious engagement with the question of what the convergences between the ancient traditions meant, and whether the institution in Rome had a clearer view of their significance than it had made publicly available. The Italian scholar and sumerologist Arcangelo Raffaele Sodi, whose work on Babylonian astronomical texts in the 1930s and 40s included extended analysis of the relationship between the precessional calculations in those texts and the structure of Enochic calendrical material, corresponded with Vatican Library staff during his research, and was granted access to Syriac manuscript materials that are not widely studied. His published work, which appeared in Italian-language academic journals of limited international circulation, noted convergences between the Vatican's Syriac holdings and the Babylonian astronomical tradition that he described with careful scholarly restraint as warranting further investigation. The further investigation he called for does not appear to have been conducted in any form that has reached the published record. The French scholar René Labat, whose authoritative work on Babylonian medical and astronomical texts in the mid-20th century made him one of the leading figures in Assyriology, noted in the preface to one of his major reference works that certain categories of Babylonian astronomical astrological material appeared to have survived into the early medieval period in forms that suggested institutional preservation rather than casual transmission, and that the most likely institutional vehicle for this preservation in the Western context was the apparatus of the early church. Labat was a careful scholar who did not speculate beyond his evidence, and his observation was framed as a direction for future research rather than a conclusion. The direction he indicated has been followed, in part, by subsequent researchers working on the transmission of Babylonian astronomical knowledge into medieval European scientific traditions, and their work has confirmed that the transmission was more substantial and more direct than earlier scholarship had recognized, moving through Syriac and Arabic intermediaries into Latin scholarly culture in ways that the Vatican's own manuscript holdings document in partial but significant detail. What troubled the researchers who encountered these convergences most consistently was not any single parallel, but the cumulative weight of the pattern. The way that separate lines of evidence from separate archives in separate languages kept arriving at the same structural conclusions about what the oldest traditions described and what the institutions that preserved them understood about the significance of what they held. Serious scholarship does not deal in certainties about matters this ancient and this complex, and the responsible position remains one of careful, documented uncertainty. But the researchers who spent careers with these materials sometimes allowed themselves, in the more reflective passages of their published work or in the correspondence that survives in their personal archives, to note that the uncertainty they maintained professionally did not quite capture the feeling generated by the evidence itself, the sense that something coherent was present in the convergences, patient and old, and not yet fully named. Silence is not the same as absence. An archive that has not released certain materials is not an archive that does not possess them, and the distinction matters enormously when one is trying to understand what any given institution actually knows about any given subject. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, which was known until 2019 as the Vatican Secret Archive, a name whose translation from the Latin Archivum Secretum has generated considerable misunderstanding given that the word secretum in this context carried the meaning of private or belonging to the Pope, rather than the modern English connotation of something deliberately concealed, holds the accumulated administrative and diplomatic records of the papacy extending back to the 8th century of the Common Era. Its holdings include the correspondence of popes with rulers, councils and communities across 15 centuries, the records of ecclesiastical tribunals, the documentation of the proceedings of church councils, and a vast quantity of administrative material that has been the subject of serious historical research since Pope Leo XIII opened the archive to qualified scholars in 1881. What the archive holds, even in its accessible portions, is one of the most significant bodies of historical documentation in the world. The opening of the archive's holdings from the pontificate of Pope Pius XI in 2006, and subsequently the further opening of materials from the pontificate of Pope Pius XII in 2020, represent genuine and significant expansions of scholarly access to historical materials that had previously been restricted. Researchers who have worked in the archive since these openings have produced important historical scholarship on topics, including the Church's diplomatic relationships during the Second World War, the proceedings of various ecclesiastical commissions, and the correspondence between the Vatican and political authorities in multiple countries across the 20th century. The archive's staff, who are professionals trained in the management and conservation of historical records, facilitate access for credentialed researchers with procedures that are documented and consistent. This is an institution that takes its responsibilities as a historical archive seriously, and the expansion of access in recent decades reflects a genuine, if gradual, movement toward greater openness. And yet the archive is large, and not all of it has been opened, and the portions that remain restricted are restricted for reasons that the institution has not always made explicit in ways that satisfy outside observers. The practical reasons for restricted access to some materials are straightforward and legitimate. The need to protect the privacy of individuals named in relatively recent documents, the physical fragility of certain manuscript materials that cannot safely be handled by large numbers of researchers, and the simple logistical challenge of processing and cataloguing holdings of this scale. An archive that extends across 85 linear kilometres of shelving cannot be opened comprehensively at a single moment, and the process of making materials accessible requires preliminary conservation and cataloguing work that takes time and resources. These are real constraints, and they account for a significant portion of what remains inaccessible at any given moment. But the archive also contains categories of material whose restricted status reflects something other than purely practical constraints, and the institution's own descriptions of its holdings acknowledge the existence of sections that have not been fully catalogued, and whose contents are therefore not precisely known, even to the archive's own staff. The oldest portions of the holdings, those predating the systematic reorganization of the archive under various popes across the early modern period, represent a particularly complex case. because the materials in these sections were organised according to the administrative logic of the periods in which they were created rather than any modern archival standard, and the work of understanding what they contain requires the kind of specialised paleographic and linguistic expertise that is in limited supply even within an institution as well-resourced as the Vatican. Scholars who have requested access to specific categories of older material have sometimes been informed that the relevant items have not yet been fully catalogued and cannot therefore be made available, a response that is archivally accurate but that also has the effect of maintaining the practical inaccessibility of materials whose existence is acknowledged but whose contents remain unknown. The question of what the Vatican's holdings might contain regarding the specific traditions we have been following through this account, the Mesopotamian cosmological texts, the Enochic materials, the early Christian engagements with the ancient sky-being traditions, is one that the published scholarly literature addresses only partially. The Vatican Library's published catalogues of its Syriac, Coptic and Oriental manuscript collections are detailed and professionally compiled, and the materials they describe have been accessible to scholars for generations. But catalogues describe what has been catalogued, and the gap between the catalogued and the uncatalogued portions of holdings as large as the Vatican's is wide enough to contain significant unknowns. Researchers who have worked extensively with the Vatican's Oriental manuscript collections have noted, in their published work and in less formal communications, the sense that the catalogued materials represent a visible portion of a larger whole, whose full extent and character remain to be determined. The institution's own statements about what it holds and what it does not are careful in ways that reflect a genuine institutional culture of discretion, a preference for measured acknowledgement over either comprehensive disclosure or outright denial. When asked about specific categories of ancient material, Vatican Library officials tend to respond with accurate statements about the catalogued holdings and appropriate acknowledgements of uncertainty about the uncatalogued ones, which is the responsible archival position, and also, incidentally, a position that neither confirms nor definitively excludes the possibility that the holdings extend further into the ancient cosmological tradition than the public catalogues indicate. The silence that surrounds certain questions about the archive's contents is, in this sense, genuinely informative, not because it proves concealment, but because it accurately reflects a condition of real and substantial uncertainty about what an institution of this age and this accumulated breadth of acquisition actually possesses in its deepest rooms. There is a particular kind of institutional knowledge that does not reside in any single document, but in the accumulated familiarity of generations of scholars who have worked within a collection and developed, through long exposure, a sense of its character that exceeds what any catalogue can capture. The archivists and librarians who have spent careers within the Vatican's holdings carry this kind of knowledge, and its transmission from one generation to the next through the informal processes of professional mentorship and institutional culture means that some of what the institution knows about what it holds is not written down anywhere that an outside researcher could access. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply the way that very old institutions with very large collections work, accumulating over centuries not only documents, but the particular unteachable familiarity with those documents that comes from decades of daily proximity. What the institution knows, in this fullest sense, and what it has chosen to say about what it knows, are questions that the archive's silence addresses obliquely, in the way that all significant silences do, by making present, through its very shape and texture, the outline of what it surrounds. Picture for a moment a man standing on the roof of a mud brick building in the city of Nippur, sometime in the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, in the last hour before dawn, in the month the Babylonians would later call Nisanu, which falls in what we now think of as late March and early April, the season when the agricultural year turns and the irrigation channels fill again with the snowmelt carried down from the mountains of the north by the Tigris and the Euphrates. He has been on this roof since the third watch of the night, which began when the moon set below the western horizon and left the sky to the stars alone. He wears a linen garment that was ritually cleaned before he put it on, and he carries a clay tablet and a stylus, and for the past several hours he has been doing what his father did on this same roof, and what his father's father did before him, recording the positions of the 5 visible planets against the background of the fixed stars, noting the degree of atmospheric clarity, and watching for any deviation from the predicted positions that the long tables of numbers in the archive below him had led him to expect. He is cold. His feet are bare on the baked clay of the roof, and the sky above him is very large and very still. Now hold that image and place beside it another one, separated from the first by roughly 37 centuries and by the full width of the Mediterranean world. A Jesuit astronomer at the observatory on Mount Graham in Arizona, sometime in the early hours of a clear desert morning in early spring, sits at a workstation in the warm interior of a dome, while the telescope above him tracks an object in the sky. According to coordinates entered into the control system earlier in the evening, the object he is studying tonight is a distant galaxy, whose light left its source before the first cities of Mesopotamia were built, and the data his instrument is collecting will be processed by software and submitted eventually to a peer-reviewed journal where other astronomers will evaluate the methodology and the conclusions. He has been at this workstation since midnight. He will stay until the sky begins to lighten. Outside the dome, the desert is cold and silent, and the stars are extraordinary in the absence of any competing light, and the mountain under his feet has been called, by the people who have lived near it for centuries, the place of the frogs, a name given long before any telescope pointed upward from its summit. What would the priest of Nippur recognize in the Jesuit astronomer's situation, and what would he find wholly foreign? The foreignness is obvious and vast. The electronic equipment, the climate-controlled dome, the mathematical frameworks developed across 25 centuries of accumulated science, the conceptual distance between the Babylonian understanding of what the sky was and the modern astrophysical one. These are not small differences. They represent the full accumulated transformation of the human relationship with knowledge across the entire span of recorded civilization, and to minimize them would be to misrepresent both traditions. The Nippur priest and the Jesuit astronomer are not doing the same thing in any simple sense, and the respectful acknowledgement of that difference is part of what honest engagement with both traditions requires. And yet the priest would recognize something. He would recognize the hour, the cold before dawn when the sky's clearest and the seeing is steadiest, and the world below has not yet begun to generate the thermal disturbances that blur the atmosphere as the day warms. He would recognize the posture of sustained attention, the trained stillness of a person who has learned, through years of practice, to set aside the ordinary distractions of the body and direct a focused, patient gaze at something very far away. He would recognize the tablet and the stylus in their modern forms, the workstation and the keyboard, as instruments of record, tools for translating what the eye receives into a permanent notation that can be compared with previous records and transmitted to future ones. He would recognize the institutional framework, the fact that both men work not as isolated individuals, but as participants in a continuous tradition, maintained by an institution that existed before they were born and will continue after they are gone. And he would recognize, above everything else, the sky itself, the same sky, carrying the same stars in their long, slow procession, the same planets moving against the same background of fixed lights that his own stylus had traced on clay 37 centuries before. The continuity that connects these two figures is not mystical. It is institutional and practical and deeply human. The continuity of a species that has never been able to stop looking upward and asking what is there, and what it means that it is there. The specific answers given to that question have changed beyond recognition across the distance between the Nippur rooftop and the Arizona dome. The Babylonian priest understood the planets as divine beings whose movements communicated the intentions of the Anunnaki to those trained to read their language. The Jesuit astronomer understands them as physical objects whose movements are governed by the mathematics of gravity and orbital mechanics. These are not reconcilable frameworks in any straightforward sense, and the attempt to force a reconciliation between them produces distortions in both directions. What connects the two men is not their answers but their question, and the institutional commitment to ensuring that the question is never abandoned, never allowed to go unasked for a single clear night. The sky over Rome on a clear autumn night, when the light pollution eases slightly and the higher stars become visible above the ambient glow of the city, shows the same constellations that the first Jesuit astronomers in the Vatican service learned to name in their training, the same ones that the Byzantine scholars who brought manuscripts to Rome in the 15th century had studied in Constantinople, the same ones whose rising and setting times were recorded in the cuneiform tablets that the scribes of Nippur copied and recopied across 2,000 years of continuous scribal tradition. The Pleiades rise in the east in late October as they have always risen, and Orion follows them across the winter sky with the same three-starred belt that the Babylonians called the Heavenly Shepherd's Staff, and the planet that we still call by its Roman name Jupiter moves through the zodiac in its 12-year cycle, as it moved through the Babylonian zodiac under a different name that meant the same thing, the Bright Wanderer, the one that returns. As you rest tonight wherever the sky is above you, it is the same sky. The priest of Nippur stood under it with cold feet and a clay tablet. The archivist in the Vatican's oldest rooms has sat under its light filtered through high stone windows for 5 centuries of accumulated generations. The astronomer on the mountain in Arizona has opened a dome to receive it tonight, as someone will open a dome to receive it tomorrow night and the night after that, until the institution decides for whatever reason to stop watching, which it has not done yet. The question the sky contains has not been answered. It has only been recorded in clay and in vellum and in digital storage by different hands in different languages across the full span of the time that human beings have been careful enough and patient enough and troubled enough by the size of the darkness above them to keep looking up. A tradition is alive when it is still being argued with. The moment a body of thought stops generating disagreement, stops producing scholars who push against its conclusions, and researchers who find in its margins questions the main text has not answered, it has crossed a threshold from the living to the preserved, from an active conversation to a closed one. By this measure, the traditions we have followed through this long account are very much alive. The comparative study of Mesopotamian cosmology, Anunnaki literature, and early Christian theological engagement with ancient sky-being narratives is not a field populated exclusively by enthusiasts working outside the academy. It is a field of genuine, documented, peer-reviewed scholarly activity, pursued by researchers at universities and research institutions across Europe, North America and the Middle East, whose work appears in academic journals and in monographs published by university presses, and whose conclusions, while carefully hedged and rigorously evidenced, have continued to expand the picture of what the ancient traditions contained and how they travelled across cultures and centuries. The discipline of Assyriology, the scholarly study of the cuneiform languages and the civilizations that produced them, has grown substantially in depth and sophistication since the first tablets from Nineveh and Nippur reached European museums in the 19th century. The number of trained cuneiformists working today is not large, perhaps a few hundred worldwide, but the quality and the range of the scholarship they produce has never been greater, supported by digital imaging technologies that have made previously unreadable tablets accessible, and by online databases that allow researchers to search across tens of thousands of texts in ways that would have required years of manual work in earlier generations. The picture of the Anunnaki tradition that emerges from this contemporary scholarship is considerably more complex and nuanced than the broad outlines available to earlier generations, and the research continues to produce new findings, new translations of previously unstudied tablets, and new analyses of the relationships between different versions of the ancient narratives. The study of the Anunnaki literature and its relationship to the Mesopotamian traditions has similarly deepened across the past several decades, driven in part by the continuing scholarly processing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whose Aramaic Enochic fragments have allowed researchers to work with the oldest surviving portions of the text in ways that were not possible before the Qumran discovery. The publication of the complete Dead Sea Scrolls in accessible scholarly editions across the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s opened this material to a wider range of researchers and the field of Second Temple Judaism, which encompasses the period and the communities within which the Enochic literature was composed and transmitted, has become one of the more active areas of biblical and religious studies scholarship. The researchers working in this field include specialists whose training spans Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and Akkadian, and whose comparative work across these language traditions has produced a much clearer picture of the channels through which Babylonian cosmological material entered the Jewish literary tradition during and after the Babylonian exile. Within the Catholic intellectual tradition, the engagement with these questions has proceeded along lines that reflect the particular institutional culture of a church that takes its historical and theological continuity seriously, and that approaches potentially unsettling material with the methodical care of an organization that has been managing the relationship between faith and knowledge for 2,000 years. Jesuit scholars in particular, whose order has historically placed a high premium on intellectual rigor and breadth, have contributed to the academic literature on ancient cosmology, the history of astronomy, and the theological implications of discoveries in both fields. the work of Jesuit theologians and historians who have engaged with the ancient traditions does not, in its published form, draw conclusions that would alarm the institution they serve, but it does, in many cases, demonstrate a familiarity with the full range of the ancient material and a willingness to take its questions seriously that goes beyond what a purely defensive institutional posture would produce. The Vatican Observatory's own researchers have continued to publish on topics that intersect, at their edges, with the broader questions this account has traced. Work on near-Earth objects, on the search for biosignatures in planetary atmospheres, and on the theological implications of the detection of extraterrestrial life all appear in the published output of Vatican Observatory staff, alongside the purely technical astronomical research that forms the core of the institution's scientific program. The observatory maintains an active public engagement program, including a lecture series and a website that makes the work of its researchers accessible to non-specialist audiences, and the tone of this public engagement reflects an institution that has made a considered decision to be present and articulate in conversations about the relationship between ancient traditions and contemporary scientific inquiry rather than absent from them. The decision to be present is itself a form of institutional positioning, a statement that the questions being asked in those conversations are ones the institution regards as worth engaging with rather than deflecting. Outside the formal institutional structures, the broader cultural conversation about the ancient traditions and their contemporary significance has never been more active or more widely distributed. The combination of digitized scholarly resources, accessible translations of ancient texts, and platforms for the dissemination of research and interpretation to general audiences has produced a situation in which the Sumerian king lists, the Atrahasis, the Book of Enoch, and the astronomical records of the Babylonian observatories are more widely read today than they have been at any point since the ancient cities that produced them were still inhabited. The quality of popular engagement with these materials varies enormously, from serious and well-informed writing that draws on current scholarship to work that treats the ancient traditions as raw material for elaborately constructed contemporary narratives that the evidence does not support. Both exist, and the distance between them is large, and navigating that distance requires the same tools that the ancient scribes of Nippur brought to their own work: patience, care, a willingness to distinguish between what the text actually says and what one wishes it said, and a respect for the genuine difficulty of the questions the texts raise. The people who still watch, in whatever sense that phrase applies, are a diverse group connected by their shared orientation toward the same set of persistent questions. They include the Assyriology graduate student working through an unstudied tablet in a museum basement in London, and the Jesuit astronomer adjusting the tracking on a telescope in the Arizona desert before dawn, and the archivist in the Vatican Library, who handles a Syriac manuscript that has not been fully studied, and who sets it down at the end of the working day knowing that it contains more than the afternoon's work has uncovered. They include the theologian who reads the Book of Enoch alongside the cuneiform creation narratives and finds in their convergence a question that neither tradition answers on its own. They are not a single community with a shared agenda. They are separate people doing separate work who have arrived, through different paths, at the same ancient crossroads. The crossroads has been there for 5,000 years. The questions posted at it have not changed, and the sky above it is the same sky it has always been, patient and very large, and full, the oldest traditions tell us, of things that have not yet finished returning. We have travelled a long way tonight, and the hour has grown very still. From the reed marshes at the edge of the earlier Sumerian cities, where the first scribes pressed their first careful marks into wet clay by the light of oil lamps, while the stars wheeled slowly overhead, to the vaulted corridors of a library in Rome, where manuscripts that cross deserts and centuries rest in the quiet dark of climate-controlled rooms, we have followed a single long thread. It is a thread made of questions rather than answers, and it has passed through the hands of Babylonian priest astronomers and Byzantine scholars and Ethiopian monks and Jesuit researchers and Vatican archivists, each one holding it briefly and passing it forward to the next, none of them quite able to say where it leads or whether it leads anywhere at all. The thread is still in motion. You have been holding one end of it tonight, here in your particular darkness, in whatever corner of the world has grown quiet around you as the hour has deepened. The question at the heart of this account is not one that resolves itself neatly, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise in these final minutes together. What the Vatican knows about the Anunnaki and the traditions associated with their expected return is not something that any outside researcher has been able to state with precision, and the responsible acknowledgement of that uncertainty is itself part of the answer. What we can say, with confidence grounded in documented history, is that the institution in Rome has held the texts of the ancient traditions longer and in greater variety than any other single institution in the Western world, that its scholars have engaged with those traditions seriously across many centuries, and that the astronomical program it has maintained since the 16th century represents an unbroken institutional commitment to watching the sky that predates the telescope and has outlasted every other similarly ancient skywatching tradition in Europe. Whether that commitment is connected, in ways the institution has not made public, to the specific expectations encoded in the oldest cosmological texts is a question the evidence circles without quite answering. It circles it with enough consistency to make the circling itself worth noting. Think for a moment of all the nights that stand behind this one. The night in Nippur, around 2,000 years before the Common Era, when a scribe finished copying the Atrahasis onto a fresh clay tablet and set it to dry in the courtyard, where the same stars that are above you now were above him then, though the names he had for them were different, and the meanings he assigned to their positions were organised around a cosmological framework that no living person was trained to fully inhabit. The night in Ethiopia, perhaps in the 12th century of the Common Era, when a monk in a highland monastery by the light of a tallow candle copied the Book of Enoch and Ge'ez, preserving for 14 more centuries a text that the Western Church had set aside, a text that described beings who came down from the sky and taught humanity to read the stars. The night in 1773 when James Bruce, having carried 3 manuscript copies of that same text out of the city of Gondar, sat in a tent somewhere between the Ethiopian highlands and the coast, perhaps looking up at the same southern stars that the monks who had copied his manuscripts had looked at from their monastery walls, aware that he was carrying something whose significance he could feel without being able to fully name. All of those nights are behind this one, the way that all the tributaries of a river are behind the water that passes a particular point on its journey to the sea. You cannot see them from where you are, but they are present in the current that carries you. The questions the Sumerian scribes encoded in their clay, the questions the Ethiopian monks preserved in their Ge'ez manuscripts, the questions the Jesuit astronomers carried with them into their observatory domes are not separate questions. They are the same question asked in different languages and different centuries by people who looked up at the same darkness and felt in their different ways the same weight of what they could not yet understand pressing down on them from above. That weight is still there. You have rested under it tonight, perhaps without thinking of it as anything other than the ordinary sky. The ancient traditions that describe the Anunnaki's departure are consistent on one point that is easy to overlook amid the more dramatic details of the narratives. The departure was not understood as permanent. The texts do not describe a final severing of the connection between the sky and the earth, a door closed and locked and the key thrown away. They describe a withdrawal, a stepping back, a reduction in the directness of contact that left traces everywhere in the institutions and the knowledge systems and the calendar cycles that the withdrawn beings had helped to establish. The temples continued to be maintained after the presence they were built to house had become less immediate. The astronomical records continued to be kept after the beings whose movements they tracked had ceased to walk in the cities of the plain. The texts continued to be copied after the civilization that first composed them had crumbled into the same dust that eventually covered its ruins. Something in each of these acts of continuation carries, if you read it carefully, an expectation, not a certainty, not a demand, an expectation held quietly. The way a household holds the expectation of a member who has been absent for a long time, and whose return has not been announced but has also not been ruled out. The institution in Rome has held that expectation, whether or not it would use that word for it, in the form of the texts it has preserved, and the sky it has watched, and the measured silence it has maintained around the oldest questions in its care. It has done so through the rise and fall of every political order that has surrounded it across 15 centuries of institutional continuity, through the transformation of the human understanding of the cosmos from a hierarchy of divine spheres to an expanding universe of inconceivable scale, through the recovery of the ancient texts that gave the tradition its oldest surviving written form. The continuity is the statement. Whether the statement is about faith, or about knowledge, or about both, or about something that does not yet have a name that fits, is a question you can carry with you into sleep. The wind, if there is one where you are tonight, is moving the same air that moved over the marshes of Sumer and the hills of Judea and the highlands of Ethiopia and the mountains of Arizona. The darkness outside your window is the same darkness that the priest of Nippur stood in, on his rooftop with his cold feet and his clay tablet. The stars, if they are visible to you tonight, are the same stars. They have been there for all of this, patient and unchanged, carrying whatever they carry in their slow circuits across the sky, and they will be there tomorrow night and the night after that, and you will be here, or somewhere nearby, resting under them as human beings have always rested, in the small warmth of an interior space, in the particular quiet of an hour when the world has set aside its urgency and allowed itself for a little while to simply be still. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of the ancient questions settle gently, the way dust settles in an archive at the end of a long day, onto the surface of whatever rest is waiting for you. The thread will be here when morning comes, the sky will keep. Sleep well wherever in the world you are tonight.